نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Last talk, we were talking about the genealogy of the early Arabs. We talked about the Arabs who had gone extinct. We talked about the remaining two Arabs, which were the Qahtans or the Qahtanis and the Adnanis. And we said that the ancestry of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam comes from the Adnani Arabs, right? These are the people who descended from Ibrahim alayhi salam onwards. Ibrahim alayhi salam came from Ur. He left Ismail alayhi salam in Makkah, and that is where the Adnani Arabs come from. And they are the ones who learned the Arabic language, right? The one because Arabic was not their natural language, they learned it from the Qahtanis. And however, over time, because they settled in Central Arabia, um, and because geographically it was central, all other tribes, including sort of the original Arabs, went through and interacted with them. They took the best of all Arab cultures, and eventually they became more eloquent and prestigious than the original Arabs, than the Qahtanis. And that is the lineage of Arabs and the genealogy of them from where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam comes. All right. So this is how we know this is where the Prophet ﷺ is established himself in the Arab line. Now, today, inshallah, we will shed some light upon the religious status of the Arabs and the rest of the world before the coming of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. One of the reasons that we will talk about this is to appreciate the blessing that the Prophet came with. Okay, when we understand pre-Islamic era, we appreciate the Islamic era. When we understand the Jahiliyyah, the ignorant times and their idolatry, we appreciate the blessing of sending or the coming of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the blessing from Allah to have sent the Prophet to this world, and now the benefits of it that we get to reap. Okay, so we know that every nation has had a prophet, all right? And one of the prophets of the Arabs was Ibrahim alayhi salam. And Ibrahim alayhi salam sanctioned many practices which remained for thousands and thousands of years until the coming of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, what were some of these practices? When I say that these practices were sanctioned by Ibrahim alayhi salam and they remained for thousands of years, I mean that they even remained within the era of Jahiliyyah, within the era of Arab ignorance in which the Prophet came. And while they got corrupted in their own way, these practices actually still remained there from the Sunnah of Ibrahim alayhi salam. All right. The first one is to consider Makkah sacred. Because as we know, we Muslims, we call Makkah al-Haram and or al-Haram. And al-Haram means the sacred. Okay. Um, Now you might think to yourself, how is it? That haram can mean sacred, but we also call something haram, which is forbidden. The reason being is because Makkah is called Al-Haram because many things that are halal or that are like permissible outside of the barrier of Makkah, outside of the Haram, are actually forbidden inside of it. Okay. For example, you are not allowed to hunt animals in Makkah. Okay. You're not allowed to pull a leaf or break a flower from inside of the haram. You cannot harm or do any such thing to these natural things. Okay. In fact, in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whoever enters the haram is safe. And this is a ruling we still apply in our Sharia. In fact, Ibn Abbas has said that a person would see the murderer of his father doing tawaf, and he would not touch a hair on his head, because you cannot fight like that. You cannot hit people, you cannot hurt people, and not just people, you cannot hurt any living being within the boundaries of Makkah, within the boundaries of Haram. This is just one of the examples. And that is why it's called Haram, because a lot of things inside of it are forbidden that are otherwise permissible and allowed outside of it because of its sacredness, because of the sacredness of the place itself. Okay. The second thing that Ibrahim alayhi salam sanctioned, and that remained in practice for many, many thousands of years until the Prophet came, is showing respect to the Kaaba. We show respect to the Kaaba now, and the Arabs of before showed respect to the Kaaba as well. The third thing is instituting the 4 sacred months. And in these 4 sacred months, all hostility was to stop. And you were not allowed to engage in any kind of warfare. Everybody had to be at peace in these 4 months. These are the months of Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hajjah, Muharram, and Rajab. And this is also a practice that continued on from the time of Ibrahim and Ismail alayhi salam. And then the fourth practice was Hajj, with all of its rites and rituals, doing tawaf, doing sa'i, the aspect of sacrificing animals around the haram, the aspect of decorating animals that are assigned to be sacrificed. You might think to yourself right now, literally, Abi, we just talked about you cannot harm an animal within haram, and now you are saying harm an animal within haram? Well, yes, these were the rites of Hajj. Hajj was a special time and a special moment, and therefore the sacrifices that Ibrahim alayhi salam had to do of animals under the religious ritual practice of Hajj was separate. So now one might wonder that if the Arabs had a prophet who was Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he taught Tawheed, which is oneness of God, then where did paganism come from? The Prophet ﷺ has actually told us when and where and how it began. There is a hadith in Sahih Muslim where the Prophet ﷺ says, I saw Amr ibn Luhay. I saw Amr ibn Luhay al-Khuza'i wandering around in the fire of hell with his entrails cut open behind him, meaning he was being punished in a very humiliating manner. Why? Because he was the first to change the religion of Ismail alayhi salam. Excuse me. He was the first one to introduce superstitions. Okay. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that it is not Allah who instituted superstitions like those of like a slit ear camel or a she camel let loose for free pasture, or idol sacrifices for the twin birds and animals, or stallion camels freed from work. Allah is basically stating that, superstitions are absolute nonsense. But Amr ibn al-Hayy is the one who began these superstitions. It is actually narrated that Amr ibn al-Hayy traveled to Syria, where the Amalek resided, okay, or the Amalekites, as we say in English. The Amalek are basically known to have been like a tribe of quite tall people. He found them to be a very powerful civilization, and they worship idols. And he asked them, what are these idols you worship? And they told him that these are our sources of power. When we're in drought, when we're in hunger, when enemy attacks, we pray to these idols and miracles somehow happen. So then Amr said, can you gift me one of these? And they actually gave him a title called Hubal. So this became the first idol of the Arabian Peninsula and also became the main idol of the Quraysh. One interesting tangent over here is that, hundreds of years later, in the Battle of Uhud, in Ghazwa Uhud, when Abu Sufyan thought that his pagan army had won against the Muslims, he shouted, Ur'lul Hubal, meaning Hubal has won. And so he actually mentions that very first idol that Amr first brought into Arabia. And so when the Prophet heard that, by the way, of course, of the Battle of Uhud, we're going to talk about this in later time as well. But when the Prophet heard him say that, he told Hazrat Umar radiallahu anhu, respond back to Abu Sufyan. And Umar asked, how do I respond back? And the Prophet said, say to him, Allah is our protector and you have no protector. So even hundreds of years later, these idol worshipping Arabs still remembered Hubal, and Hubal was the first idol introduced into the Arabian Peninsula that then started the downfall of Tawheed, of monotheism, into polytheism. So Amr was the one who brought this idol back, and he is the one who put it in front of the Kaaba, and this is how paganism started in Arabia. Okay. Amr ibn al-Hayy also changed the talbiya for Hajj. Okay. The original talbiya, the one that we know as right now as well. So talbiya is what you say during Hajj, what you must be saying frequently during Hajj. And that is labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika laka labbaik, which means here I am, O Allah, here I am, here I am. You have no partner, here I am. Okay. But Amr ibn al-Hayy changed it to labbaik Allahumma labbaik, labbaik la sharika laka illa sharikan huwa laka tamlikhu wa ma malak, which means here I am, O Allah, here I am, here I am. You have no partner except for a partner who belongs to you, and you control the partner and all that he controls. Which basically means that he said, you have partners, O Allah, but you are the big boss. There are little smaller gods underneath you, but you are the capital G God. And then there are small g gods all underneath you, which is just like, for example, what the ancient Greeks would say about like a main god and a minor god. Okay. So Amr ibn al-Luhay invented this new talbiya of Hajj, and therefore almost sort of invented this new religion. I will stop here to let you guys know that there are some scholars who say that it was actually not Amr ibn al-Luhay who invented this, but rather people a few generations after. But regardless of when this talbiya came into being, this idea of there being like little interventionists between our connection to Allah, these smaller G gods between our connection to Allah, was an idea that did come into Arabia. And that is what then gave introduction to this polytheism, this idea of worshiping an idol, of worshiping something other than what Allah has stated for us to worship, as if they're somehow going to give us a better connection to God. Okay? So where did Amr ibn Luhay live? Unfortunately, we don't quite know precisely because Arabs have no sort of real measures of dates. They don't record dates, okay? But rather they record occasions. They don't really have a calendar, and they didn't really import like Roman or Persian or Jewish calendars until Umar radiallahu anhu started the Islamic calendar. Okay. So they used to demarcate dates by marking big events. Okay. We know the Am al-Fil, the year of the elephant. We know then they'll say sort of 3 years after the elephant attack or 2 years before the big battle. Okay. So obviously when it comes to translating where Amr ibn al-Luhay lived, it's very difficult for us to fully comprehend, fully understand that. But we know that he belonged to the same generation around the time of Fihr, and Fihr was the founder of the Quraysh. Okay, so we can roughly estimate that Amr ibn al-Luhay must have lived about the 1st century of the Christian era, which is approximately 500 years before the coming of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so over 500 years, paganism spread. It got introduced by Amr ibn al-Hayy, and then it spread over the span of 5 centuries. So how did one man single-handedly change the entire religion of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam, or the religion that they had introduced into society? There are 3 factors for why that happened. Factor number 1, there was a sense of inferiority complex that Amr had towards the advanced Amalekites. or the Amalek, okay? These were the people who were a very powerful civilization. They had a history of writing, architecture, large, magnificent buildings, and they were known to have been completely undefeated. So when Amr ibn Luhay felt a complex of inferiority complex when comparing himself to them, he assumed that the Amalekites must be correct in everything because they've done so well in these other aspects of society that they must be doing well in everything, including spirituality and religion. He was so astounded, he assumed that they must be upon guidance because they are doing so great in everything else. So, what did he do? He took from their theology and he introduced their theology into his own people and his own society. The second reason why he could bring about such a big change is because Amr ibn Luhay was a very influential person among his own people. Okay, he was the chieftain of the Khuza'a. He was one of the most respected people in society. He had a lot of power. He was very generous. He won lots of different battles. And so the people around him followed him for his credentials and his prestige that he had. And the Khuza'a at that time were in charge of Makkah for a certain time period. So because he was the chieftain of the people in charge of Makkah, naturally, whatever he introduced into society really took like fire. And so that is when idolatry spread within Makkah. Okay. And the third reason is that there must have been at least 2,000 years, at least, between Amr ibn Luhay and Ibrahim alayhi salam. So there was a long time where there was no guidance. And so when there is no guidance for such a long time, then there are chances for ignorance to prevail. And there are even narrations, by the way, that say that the shaitan actually inspired Amr ibn Luhay through dreams with the names of the very first idols. The names of the 5 idols from the time of Nuh alayhi salam, as they're mentioned in the Quran, are Wad, Suwa', Yaghuth, Ya'uq, and Nasr. And in a hadith, Ibn Abbas mentions the story of these 5 righteous men before the time of Nuh alayhi salam, who, when they died, people actually built their statues to remind them of their piety. But as time went on and generations passed, instead of just looking at the statues, instead of just looking at the statues and remembering the people behind those statues and how incredible those people were, they actually began venerating and worshiping them. And so Shaitan used the righteousness of these 5 men as a stepping stone into idolatry. So that's how idolatry started within humankind, within the children of Adam. Okay? And so Amr ibn Luhay actually resurrected this. And so they were worshipped in pre-Islamic Arabia, even though their names were forgotten for millennia. Okay, so one tribe actually had the Wad statue, another actually had the Suwa statue. Okay, so what is a lesson we learn from the way Amr ibn Luhay introduced idolatry into a monotheistic Arabian society at that time? By comparing himself to a people that were doing well in the world, and then thinking as if everything that they are doing is right and absolutely correct. Simply because a nation is powerful and has technology does not mean that they have the correct morality or the correct ethics or the correct theology. Just because they are good in one thing, we must not automatically assume that they are the best in everything else. We don't need to extrapolate being good in technology with being the ones with the correct theology. It's not the same. Okay. And this speaks very much to our current situation right now as Muslims of the world, because we tend to think that, oh my God, the West is doing so much better than we are. And so therefore, we must import all of their ideologies within our society as well, because, maybe Islam needs a bit of modernization. Why do we think that? Don't you think that's sort of the same kind of thought process as Amr ibn Luhay had? Why do we feel a sense of an inferiority complex if we think to ourselves that just because a country like the United States of America is doing so much better than we are in other spheres of life, that somehow they have gotten theology and religion correct? That is not necessary. And I would argue, actually, Islam has theology and religion correct, and nobody else really. Right? So there's this thing that we do where we conflate somebody being successful in one sphere to them being successful in everything across the board, all vision, which is not true. People can have their strengths and their weaknesses in different spheres, in different Venn diagrams, and we just need to pick and choose from the best. And let's be honest, when it comes to religion, we already know that Islam is the best. So we need to choose our religion. We need to be excellent in our religion. Now, what are the various paganistic practices that came about within pre-Islamic Arabia? The first one we learn is that in times of Jahili, in times of ignorance, whenever a caravan left Makkah, they would chip away a rock from the Kaaba and take it as the equivalent of an idol, and they would worship it. We're going through why some of these paganistic practices happen, by the way, so that we can remember that when we start talking about the birth and the life of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, that we understand what kind of practices these people were doing and how the Prophet came about abolishing them. Okay? All right, so this was the first one. Them scraping away parts of the Kaaba as if it would be the equivalent of an idol, and then they would worship it. All right. A Sahabi actually mentioned that before Islam came, we worshipped rocks and stones. And if we found a rock that looked more beautiful than the one we were worshipping, we would throw the old one away and put the new one in its place. And if we were traveling in the desert and we could not find a rock, we would gather sand, put it into a pile, bring a goat, squeeze some milk out of it to make the sand firm, and then we would do tawaf around the sand. It's really mind-boggling that, intelligent people would do this. But sadly, even to this day, we see lots of people who bow down to graves or who, do all of these holy rituals in like mausoleums and in like these burial places of saints, because they think somehow it is going to bring about some kind of barakah in their lives or some kind of blessings in their lives. There is one thing that I want to clarify over here as we go on, which is that as Muslims, we do not consider the bricks of the Kaaba to be sacred or holy. Okay? The location is holy because Allah has deemed it to be holy. But the bricks of the Kaaba itself, the building itself, is simply stone and cement. Okay? A lot of people don't actually know this, but the Kaaba is rebuilt every few decades. Just like any other structure in this world would need upkeep. We all live in houses or apartments, right? Or have like walls and a roof around us. And oftentimes that wall and that roof needs rebuilding, needs some denting, painting. It does, right? And so the current Kaaba, for example, is only about a decade or more than, or like a little over a decade old. Okay? So about the very building of the Kaaba itself, its bricks and its cement and the little dust you find within the indentations of the Kaaba, there is nothing holy about that. It is the area and the land of Makkah that is sacred. Okay, before the time of the Prophet ﷺ, these people did not realize this. So they let paganism seep into them. All right. There have been so many, many moments within our own Muslim history, post the Prophet ﷺ, post the Sahabi, where the Kaaba has been destroyed in some kind of a battle, in some kind of a skirmish, in some kind of an accident. The building of the Kaaba has been ruined and then it has been rebuilt. But what do you think Muslims did when the Kaaba got destroyed? Do you think everybody just stopped praying all of a sudden? Do you think we suddenly had no idea where our Qibla was going to be? No, of course not. It is not the Kaaba that we are worshipping. It is the sanctity of Makkah that holds sacredness in our hearts. If the Kaaba was to get destroyed right now, we will still turn our faces towards Makkah when we're doing sajda in namaz, when we are praying. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has deemed it such that the Qibla is supposed to be Makkah. When we do tawaf, it is because Allah has assigned for us to do tawaf around the Kaaba. That makes that landmark to be holy and sacred and sanctimonious. But it is not the brick and mortar that we are worshipping, like people in idol worship are worshipping the brick and mortar of that idol itself. Which is why you may know, or you may not know, and therefore I'm telling you right now, that there are still some people even now who, when they go to Umrah or to Hajj, and they somehow find an exposed corner of the Kaaba where the ghilaf of the Kaaba has been slightly pulled up and they can see the bricks of the building underneath it, that they tend to take some kind of a utensil to try and scrape off some of that dust or cement or filling to take back with them because they think that is going to be sacred. La, it is not sacred. The Kaaba in its location is sacred. You taking away a piece of it, just like these pagans used to practice before, where they took a rock from the Kaaba when they were leaving, that is not sacred. That will simply be a piece of rock like any other land in this earth of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has pieces of rock in it. All right. So that's the clarification I feel like we all really need to have. Okay. So another story, another paganistic practice that the people, the Arabs before the Prophet ﷺ used to do. One of the most sort of, I will say, disgusting stories is that of Naila and Isaf. Okay. So these were two idols. Naila was put on Safa and Isaf was put on Marwa. And before Islam, the Quraysh would touch Naila and Isaf when they went back and forth doing sa'i. Remember, we said in the previous couple of minutes that they still did Hajj. So they still did sa'i during Umrah and during Hajj. The addition they had done was that they put these two idols on top of the Safa and Marwa, and they used to touch them when they went back and forth. So when Islam came, the Muslims felt hesitant that how can we do sa'i when it's meant to commemorate Naila and Isaf? And so that is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed in the Quran that inna Safa wal Marwata sha'airallahi, Safa and Marwa are from the signs of Allah. Even before the idols of Naila and Isaf ever came, which meant for the Muslims at that time that, don't feel guilty for doing sa'i, because Naila and Isaf have nothing to do with the holiness of Safa and Marwa. Aisha radiallahu anha says that since we were children, we were hearing the story of Naila and Isaf. And the books of history, the books of Arab history, say that they were two lovers. And a'udhu billah, they could not find a place to be intimate except for the interior of the Kaaba. And so they sort of consummated their romance inside of the Kaaba. And as a punishment, Allah petrified them there and there. And when the Quraysh found them, they somehow took them as a miracle and they put them on Safa and Marwa, and that's what they began to do in their sa'i. Now, can you imagine that? Why do we do sa'i? Because we remember it as an incredible act of Hazrat Hajra or Bibi Hajra when she was looking for water for her son Ismail alayhi salam, and she ran back and forth 7 times between Safa and Marwa, which is such an incredible story of celebrating the power of a woman in her motherhood when she is looking for ways to nourish her child. And yet how depraved the Quraysh had made this practice. Okay, so this was another practice that they did, which of course when the Prophet ﷺ came, The practice of Sa'i, of moving between Safa and Marwa, remained, but it was cleansed from this nonsense of a story that the Quraysh had like sort of conjured up. Okay. Then another practice that they used to do when the Prophet ﷺ conquered Makkah, which was in Fatah Makkah. We'll do that, inshallah, at a later time as well. There were about 360 idols that were of various shapes and sizes that were around the Kaaba. Okay. Some were in the shape of full humans, some were in the shape of animals. Most of them were like in the shape of half human and half animals, somehow like a child's fairy tale kind of situation. And so the Quraysh had like sort of constructed and gathered 360 idols of various shapes and sizes around the Kaaba that they all used to worship in different moments. The Quraysh also had a theology that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had daughters, na'udhu billah, who were his angels. Okay. And so they worshipped angels as well, thinking that they were the daughters of Allah. And another paganistic practice, or more sort of as like a general practice that the Quraysh used to do, was that the Arabs, or sorry, that the Arabs used to do, was that the Arabs did not have a creed. Okay. Paganistic societies often don't have a creed. And you might think to yourself, like, what do you mean by a creed? You see, us Muslims, we have our Arkan al-Iman. Our Arkan al-Iman are our pillars of faith. Okay? We have our pillars of faith. We are taught our pillars of faith from the beginning. And we're sort of instructed of what they are. The 5 pillars of our faith are, Shahada, which is the declaration of our faith, Salah, Zakat, Saum, which is fasting, and Hajj. Okay? The Quraysh didn't have that. And most paganistic creeds also don't have this. They don't have this kind of a central framework. In the current times, I would say that, Hinduism is the clearest example of an idolatrous religion, and they don't have a unified creed. They don't have an aqidah. Okay. One Hindu can worship one god, another Hindu can worship another god, and you can have 6 million Hindus worshiping 6 million different gods. And each one of them has a different perception of what his god can or cannot do. The same goes for the Arabs, okay? There was no unified creed among the Arabs. Many of them believed some things that the others did not believe, and vice versa. But the one thing they did all agree to, by the way, is that they needed to worship idols to become closer to Allah. That is what they did believe in, okay? Now, there are historical records that show that there are some exceptions to this paganism. The books of Seerah do mention that there were about a handful of people that they're called Hanif. The plural of it is Hunafa. Okay, Hunafa literally means turning away from, and so they are called Hunafa because they turned away from shirk towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one Hunafa actually is said to be Qas bin Sa'ada, Qas bin Sa'ida from Banu Iyad, he was an old man about the age of sort of 80 to 90 when the Prophet ﷺ saw him when the Prophet was young in his own 20s. Qas bin Sa'ida was about 80 to 90 years old. Okay. And so Qas used to come to Makkah for Hajj, and he was preaching against idolatry. And he was, in fact, one of the most eloquent poets because it said that his language sort of really resembled the language of the Quran. And so he used to often say that, Ya ayyuhan nas, O people, listen to me and understand. And when you hear, then benefit, because whoever lives of a surety will die, and whoever dies has finished, and everything that Allah has decreed will indeed come. And he would often also say, Ya ma'ashar al-Iyad, O people of Iyad, Where is Samud and where is Ad? Where are your fathers and where are your grandfathers? And who will reward the one who does good but is never rewarded? And who will punish the one who does injustice but is never punished? I swear by Allah, there must be a better religion than the religion you are upon. Okay. And then it said about 40 years later, in the 9th year of Hijrah, Banu Iyad, when they came to accept Islam, the Prophet ﷺ actually asked the tribesmen, where is Qus ibn Sa'ida? And they said that he died a long time ago. And the Prophet said, I remember him on a red camel, and he had a mesmerizing speech. Can anybody amongst you remind me of it? So they related what I just said to you guys, and the Prophet liked what Qus had said. So this showed that, there were some remnants of Tawheed even in pre-Islamic Arabia. And inshallah, next Tuesday, for our next talk, we're going to talk about a few more people who were considered to be the Hunafa. One of the names some of you might be familiar with if you've slightly even read the Seerah, which is Warqa ibn Nawfal ibn Asad. He was the man who was the cousin of Hazrat Khadija radiallahu anha, and he was the one who had really guided the Prophet ﷺ when the Prophet first got his wahi, the first wahi from Hazrat Jibreel, and he was around at that time. And then we will also, inshallah, in the next talk, discuss the religious status of the Romans and the Sassanids, because the Romans were upon Christianity, the Sassanids were, or the Persians, were on Zoroastrianism, and these were also sort of the influencing forces in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. All right, and then after that, we shall begin with the birth of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.